guys, Matt here. Welcome to the Seeds of Awareness video channel. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the war on drugs, which is a war that has been waged by governments all around the world for nearly 50 years now. It began in 1971 in America, where President Richard Nixon publicly announced a war on drugs. And that kind of initiated and instigated a very much a worldwide authoritarian, strict stance towards drugs, whereby if you do illicit drugs, you're a criminal, you're bad, you need to be punished, all these sort of things.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had. Fundamentally, it is essential for the American people to be alerted to this danger, to recognize that it is a danger that will not pass with the passing of the war in Vietnam, which has brought to our attention the fact that a number of young Americans have become addicts as they serve abroad, whether in Vietnam or Europe or other places.
And we've now had a very good chunk of history living under this strict kind of stance towards drugs, where we can actually step back and look at whether this has actually been a good thing for society or not. And I think the thing we need to do is start having adult conversations about it and to let go of the propaganda and the conditioning we've received around drugs, and which we sort of get pummeled into us as children, where we're sort of really taught that it's black or white. Drugs are bad, people who do drugs are bad, and there's not much else to it. But the fact of the matter is it's actually a really complex issue. And the further you look into it, the further it seems that having such a strict stance on drugs has actually exacerbated the problem and created a whole lot of division and a whole lot of issues within society that are only getting worse and worse and worse. So we really need to, as I said, step back, have adult conversations about this and look at all the issues. So what I want to do in this video is sort of point you towards some research, towards some people who have very different opinions. And these are people who've dedicated their lives to this sort of research, or who have at least researched it very deeply and have some very interesting opinions on the matter. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because recently here in Australia, unfortunately, there were some tragic deaths at a music festival called Def Con Music Festival in Sydney. And unfortunately, a couple of people died at that and overdosed on drugs. I'm not sure whether they took too much or whether it was the drugs had other stuff mixed within it, but obviously very much tragic events. And it raised a lot of public debate about our stance towards drugs, because what happened was the Premier of New South Wales, her name is, I find this name quite hard to pronounce, Gladys Berejiklian, hopefully I've pronounced that okay. She's come out publicly and done the same old classic authoritarian, strict, this is how it is stance. And this is very much how we live here in Australia particularly. We live in a nanny state where our government just tells us what to do. And we're very much conditioned to be very subservient to that. But we need to start questioning and challenging some of these things. And she's come out and she's publicly said that anyone who advocates pill testing is giving the green light to drugs, and that is absolutely unacceptable. There is no such thing as a safe drug. And this was in response to a lot of people saying we need to do pill testing to make sure that people, young people who go to these festivals who are going to do drugs anyway, at least are doing safe drugs. And she's come out and just said, no, not even considering it. That's encouraging drugs. And she publicly said, I'm going to shut down this festival. Just really authoritarian, just do what you're told, people.
I never want to see this event held in Sydney or New South Wales ever again. We will do everything we can to shut this down.
It's time that we started removing ourselves from drug dog operations and put in place amnesty bins, pill testing.
The prospect of pill testing was again rejected by police and the government.
Anyone who advocates pill testing is giving the green light to drugs.
And this raises the question about drug use, because what we've discovered is that people are going to use drugs no matter how strict the rules are, no matter how authoritarian, no matter how harsh the punishment is. We know that for sure now, because there probably hasn't been a time in human history where the punishment and the stance towards drugs has been as strict as it's been in the last 50 years. I mean, there's countries in the world like Bali, for example, where you can get the death penalty for having drugs on you, even small amounts of drugs. The death penalty, I don't know if there's any punishment harsher than that, but you know, the crazy thing is that people still do drugs in Bali. You can go to jail in many, many other countries. You can get in lots of trouble. You can get huge fines. You can have marks against, criminal charges against your name that can affect you for the rest of your life. And guess what? People will still do drugs. One thing we found is that drug use has been in human cultures for thousands and thousands of years, whether people have been using psychedelic plants or whatever, tobacco or whatever things they've been using. It seems to be that the human desire to explore altered states of consciousness, to explore different realms of our psyche and to feel different things is as deeply ingrained in us as our need and urge for food and sex and curiosity and exploration and creativity. To want to explore altered states and to have fun in that way is so deeply ingrained into us that it's become clear now that no sort of strict stance and punishments are actually going to stop people from doing it. It might deter some people, but some people, certain percentage of society, are just going to do it no matter what.
This is a debate between pragmatists who try to do the best they can in the real world and people who are idealists and want all drug taking to stop from midnight tonight. It's pragmatism versus absence.
So the government have refused to accept this. They've seen that they've had the stance that acknowledging this means giving a green light to drugs, as Gladys says, and that means people think they can just do as many drugs as they want. Whereas the other side of the argument is that let's accept that people are going to do this. Let's accept that people are going to do drugs, and let's now make sure that people doing drugs are at least doing safe drugs, because it seems that most of the issues with party drugs in particular is the fact that they're cut with so much shit. That people think they're taking ecstasy, but it's mixed with a whole lot of different other things. And so if people can at least have these tested, it might be able to save, prevent some big problems. And I was listening to the radio not long after this happened, and they got on the radio this guy who was the father of a man who had died, I think, back in the 2015 DEFCON, so the same music festival. And he was saying he really wished there'd been pill testing there for his son. He said, I don't do drugs, I don't condone drugs, but as a young person, I did drugs myself. I've tried ecstasy, I've tried LSD, I've smoked a lot of marijuana. I know what it's like as a kid. You're not going to not do it. And so he said, I wish that there had been pill testing there for my son because he died based on a faulty pill. And then another doctor came on the radio and she talked about how a festival in I think in Canberra, in the ACT state, had actually given the green light. So the state government in the ACT given the green light for pill testing at a festival called Grooving the Moo. There were 2 pills that they found that had potentially lethal doses of extra stuff added into them, and that they were able to inform these 2 people, and that those 2 people agreed to have those pills discarded and thrown away. Now, potentially there we have 2 saved lives, and we have 2 deaths at the DEFCON Music Festival where they don't allow pill testing, and then we have 2 saved lives at the Groove in the Moo festival.
After years of waiting, Australia's first pill testing trial is finally underway here at Groove in the Mood. We've just ducked in and had a chat to the team. A couple of dozen people have already come through. They've already identified some dangerous substances, and we've seen young people discarding their pills, exactly what we predicted would happen. Far from being an encouragement to take drugs, this is all about harm minimisation and keeping young people safe at these festivals.
And also, it's worked overseas. So if you look at the studies where they have used it in places like Amsterdam, it's actually worked. They've had less deaths, less overdoses, less people harming themselves.
And then it sort of starts showing you how ridiculous this strict black and white stance is by our government, which is not taking into account how complex this issue is and how many different angles we need to really look at it from. The other thing we need to do is explore our understanding of drugs, because when we explore it more, we realize that our stance towards drugs and understanding of drugs is actually quite contradictory and quite hypocritical. I've got a definition here of a drug, which it says a drug is any substance other than food that provides nutritional support that when inhaled, injected, smoked, consumed, absorbed via a patch on the skin or dissolved under the tongue causes a temporary physiological and often psychological change in the body. So what this means is that we're all drug users. If you're having coffee every day, you're a drug user. If you drink alcohol, you're a drug user. If you smoke cigarettes, you're a drug user. If you take pharmaceutical drugs, you're a drug user. Basically, the only thing that we can put in our body that isn't a drug is food and water, because the body uses those things to actually rebuild. The cells of your body actually use those to rebuild themselves with. So the food and water you consume becomes your body. A drug doesn't become your body. It just enters the body, creates chemical changes in the body, and then exits the body. So what that means is we're all drug users.
As a drug user, you are public enemy number one and won't be tolerated.
We're all drug users, yet we judge people who decide to take certain drugs as being criminals and other people who decide to have other drugs as not being criminals, and we offer the non-criminal drug users support if they've got issues, and we put the other criminal drug users in jail if they have issues with it. It's crazy. They're all drugs. The only difference is that street drugs have been made illegal, so they now get produced by the criminal underworld, and they're not clean, and they're sort of cut with all these other harmful things. And the other drugs, such as wine, alcohol, coffee, pharmaceutical drugs, are regulated and they're clean. They come with education. You know how much doses and how much you can take for it to still be safe. And they still cause a lot of overdoses, mind you. Pharmaceutical drugs are one of the highest percentage causes of overdoses still.
And so the notion that we should live in a drug-free world or have a drug-free world, that's not even really worth discussing. That's just so low level. I mean, it's hard for me to get excited about a conversation like that because it's not reality.
Right. Why are we tended as humans to go for this like binary discussion? Like you said, it's either if you're talking about drugs and you're not saying they are the devil, then by definition you're advocating them. Why do we get so ultra sensitive about something, whereas we don't get that sensitive about, say, other risky behavior like driving cars fast or this or that? What is it in us that makes us so scared about drugs?
Well, it's certain drugs now.
Right.
And so we want to be clear, because we certainly don't get queasy about conversations related to alcohol, which could, in some cases, be one of the more dangerous drugs that we have available. Or even marijuana now, we don't get queasy about that. But we certainly get uncomfortable about heroin or crack cocaine. And we do in part because drug use, the users of those drugs, we tend to look at as being other, people other than us, and people who are undesired, or undesirable people. And those undesirable people are the real reason that we are responding the way that we respond.
But the point is that we need to get out of this mindset of judging certain drugs as bad and judging certain drugs as good. There's actually not a lot of difference between caffeine and cocaine and caffeine. They both have similar effects on the body. They both make someone stimulated. They both make someone more chatty. They both make someone more alert. They both can give anxiety as a side effect. The difference is that if you said you're going down to your local cafe for a coffee, someone would say, cool, can you grab me one? If you said, I'm going down the street to get a bag of cocaine, people would think you're a bit crazy, or think you're a criminal, or think you're someone bad doing something bad. As I said, cocaine was once an over-the-counter medicine. I believe there's still you can still find advertisements from it from back in the day. Tobacco was once, nicotine was lauded as a huge health kind of invention, medicine, when it was first created. And back not that long ago, a few decades ago, there were doctors still promoting nicotine and tobacco as a medicine. And they would even tell you what their favorite brand of tobacco was.
In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, what cigarette do you smoke, doctor? Once again, the brand named most was Camel. Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment? See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
But then all of a sudden our perspective changes, and really what changes is just what the government tells us is good and bad. The government says you can explore your altered state of consciousness with this drug, but you cannot do it with this drug. And how hypocritical that someone can get themselves in the chemical state that they want with tobacco and coffee in their own home, yet someone who wishes to explore their consciousness with LSD or MDMA in the safety of their own home, harming no one else, is all of a sudden a criminal and could go to jail from it. When you look at it like that, I really personally believe it's massively hypocritical. Now, what's really, really curious is that and I do not think this is an accident at all, mind you. And this is why we need to make a stance, because all the drugs that are legal, all the drugs that are allowed, are the drugs that make us good servants to the system that we live in. They make us good citizens. They're coffee, alcohol, they all kind of narrow consciousness, make you more alert, make you more of a productive citizen on a day-to-day basis. Things like marijuana, extremely harmless drug, mind you. Things like marijuana, things like LSD, things like these, things like MDMA, things like psilocybin magic mushrooms, which I've done a video on in another video. These things expand your consciousness. You do these and you start questioning things. You start questioning, why the fuck am I working a job I don't like? Why the fuck am I listening to these rules that are imposing on my life? Why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? You start questioning everything. They give you a different observation point, and that can be incredibly beneficial for some people. You can get amazing insights. Not everyone needs those drugs to get these insights, but some people it can be really beneficial. Things like plant medicines like ayahuasca and San Pedro cactus. These things have been used in human societies for thousands of years, and there's arguments that the reason our societies and civilizations have exploded with the creativity they have is because of psychedelic use. It could even be argued that all the amazing cave paintings that exploded around the world 20 to 30, 40,000 years ago was because our ancestors started using psychedelic plants from the ground.
And over the last 30 years, researchers led by Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa and many others have suggested an intriguing and radical possibility, which is that this emergence into consciousness was triggered by our ancestors' encounters with visionary plants and the beginning of shamanism. If you analyze the cave art, there's not time to go into the details here, but there are so many details that make it clear that this was an art of altered states of consciousness, of visions. And that plants like the Amanita muscaria mushroom or psilocybin mushrooms appear to have been directly connected with this sudden and radical change.
So maybe these things are there to help us explore our consciousness, just like we like exploring mountain peaks and exploring different oceans and exploring the world. We can go into our own consciousness and explore our inner realms, and psychedelics and certain drugs can actually help us do that. But these are all the drugs that are illegal. All the drugs that in the 60s and 70s started making people stand up against the war and stand up against all the crazy atrocities by the government and make stances for peace and, you know, influence music in incredible ways, like the Beatles and all these incredible bands back then that were using psychedelics. And isn't it funny that that's exactly about the time when the war on drugs started? So this war on drugs really, in my personal opinion, is a propaganda tool, because all the evidence is pointing towards the insanity of it.
And we have erected huge apparatuses of armed bureaucracies who will invade our privacy, who will break down our doors, who will arrest us, who will send us to prison, sometimes for years, for possessing even small quantities of psilocybin or substances like DMT, whether in its smokable form or in the ayahuasca brew. And yet, ironically, DMT is, we now know, a natural brain hormone. We all have it in our bodies, and it's just that its function remains unknown for lack of research. And it's not as though our society is opposed in principle to altered states of consciousness. I mean, billions are being made by the unholy alliance of psychiatrists and big pharma in overprescribing drugs to control so-called syndromes like depression or attention deficit disorder in teenagers. And we have a love affair in our society with alcohol. We glorify this most boring of drugs, despite the terrible consequences that it often has. And of course, we love our stimulants, our tea, our coffee, our energy drinks, our sugar, and huge industries are built around these substances, which are valued because of the way they alter consciousness. But what all these approved altered states of consciousness have in common is that none of them contradict or conflict with the basic state of consciousness valued by our society, which I would call the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness, which is good for the more mundane aspects of science. It's good for the prosecution of warfare. It's good for commerce. It's good for politics. But I think everybody realizes that the promise of a society over-monopolistically based upon this state of consciousness has proved hollow, and that this model is no longer working, that it's broken in every possible sense that a model can be broken, and that urgently we need to find something to replace it. The vast problems of global pollution that have resulted from the single-minded pursuit of profit, the horrors of nuclear proliferation, the specter of hunger, that millions every night go to bed starving, that we can't even solve this problem despite our alert problem-solving state of consciousness. And look what's happening in the Amazon, the lungs of our planet, this precious home of biodiversity. The old-growth rainforest being cut down and replaced with soybean farms so we can feed cattle, so that we can all eat hamburgers. Only a truly insane global state of consciousness could allow such an abomination to occur. And I did a back-of-an-envelope calculation during the Iraq War. It seems to me that 6 months' expenditure on the Iraq War would have solved the problem of the Amazon forever, would be sufficient to compensate the peoples of the Amazon so that no single tree ever needed to be cut down again to garden and look after that amazing resource. But we can't make that decision as a global community. We can spend countless billions on warfare, on hatred, on fear, on suspicion, on division, but we can't get together the collective effort to save the lungs of our planet.
So I think there's such powerful statements by Graham there. And basically what he's saying there is what I firmly believe is that this war on drugs has not been about bringing about safety and harm reduction to society. That's been the selling point of it. That's been what they've been telling us it's for. But really, it's been so that governments, and I want to add in here the risk of sounding conspiratorial or the risk of sounding a bit cynical, but I really do firmly believe this is what the research shows, is that governments want to expand power into our lives. They want to control every area of our lives, including our consciousness. And I really don't think governments are our friends. I think it's great to have a government there to manage infrastructure, to manage affairs of human life and activity. But our governments have massively overstepped the lines, and they're corporately owned. They're sold out to the elites of the planet. The people we see in government are just puppets there just to give us the illusion of choice. But really, their goal is to impose on our life in every way possible, and that freedom, to take away more and more freedoms. And the last frontier that they've got to take away from us is our own consciousness, because we can accept that, yeah, if we're going to drive on these roads, if we're going to use cars, if we're going to do these things, if we're going to share these things that we've got in society, of course we have to follow rules. There have to be standards, there have to be regulations, and it can be good to have punishments to keep people in line. But we're being punished for exploring our own consciousness in the safety of our own homes without harming anyone. The fact that we don't think this is crazy, this shows how deeply programmed we've been in our lives to submit to authority, and how much the education system and mainstream media has pummeled us into shape where we're just so used to daddy and mummy government telling us what to do in every area of our lives. So I want to now look at a country that has actually decriminalized, they haven't legalized, but they've decriminalized drug use, which means that the drugs are still legal, but if you get caught using them, you're not going to go to jail. You're actually going to be treated as a patient and given therapy. So this is an article from Richard Branson's website that he wrote personally. He's a big advocate on legalizing and decriminalizing drugs. He says that 10 years ago, the Portuguese government responded to widespread public concern over drugs by rejecting a war on drugs approach and instead decriminalized drug possession and use. It further rebuffed convention by placing the responsibility for decreasing drug demand as well as managing dependency under the Ministry of Health rather than the Ministry of Justice, which is a really important thing to understand. With this, the official response towards drug-dependent persons shifted from viewing them as criminals to treating them as patients. Now, with a decade of experience, Portugal provides a valuable case study of how decriminalization coupled with evidence-based strategies can reduce drug consumption, dependence, HIV infection, and create safe communities for all. I will set out clearly what I learned from my visit to Portugal, and I would urge other countries to study this. So he said that 2001, Portugal became the first European country to officially abolish all criminal penalties for personal possession of drugs, including marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines. Jail time was replaced with the offer of therapy. Following decriminalization, Portugal has the lowest rate of lifetime marijuana use in the EU, for people over 15. New HIV infections in drug users fell 17% between 1999 and 2003. Deaths related to heroin and similar drugs were cut by more than half. So obviously there's different angles to that. It's not, some of those statistics might not all be attributed to the decriminalization, but what it's shown is that the results certainly haven't gotten worse in Portugal, and it looks like things have actually gotten a lot better. Okay, one more. So this is from an economic perspective. This is an economic professor. This guy's like a professor at some really good uni. I think it's Harvard or something like that. I'll put the article there. This is in a Business Insider article. It says, all drugs should be legalized, Miron says. Pot, cocaine, LSD, crystal meth, you name it. Legalizing drugs would save roughly $41.3 billion. Billion, not million, $1 billion. This is in the US, mind you, but it would definitely be the same everywhere in terms of huge savings. But it would save roughly $41.3 billion per year in government expenditure on enforcement of prohibition. Of these savings, $25.7 billion would accrue to state and local governments. Maybe we could get some of our local roads fixed here where I live in Byron Bay. They're insane. Like seriously, my car can nearly fall entirely into one of these potholes. Whilst $15.6 billion would accrue to federal government. When asked if everyone would become addicts, Miron says, no, walk down any street and you can already buy legal drugs in multiple establishments. Caffeine at Starbucks, nicotine at the supermarket, alcohol at bars and restaurants. And we're not all addicted to all of those drugs. Our current drug policy doesn't work, Miron observes. Despite $40 billion spent on enforcement and prosecution, drug use is still widespread. Meanwhile, because the products are illegal, they're dangerous, low quality and unregulated, and they generate zero tax revenue. Legalizing drugs would solve those problems, Miron says. It would help close the budget deficit, and it would eliminate a bizarre double standard in which Americans are encouraged to drink and smoke themselves to death while guzzling addictive coffee and tea, but become criminals if they dare to get stoned. So we've got some really interesting perspectives there, from an economic perspective, from one of the world's most respected and successful businessmen in Richard Branson, and researcher Graham Hancock, and coming at it from all different angles, whether you look at it from harm reduction, whether you look at it from economics, or whether you look at it from a moral perspective. All the evidence, if we look past our programming, conditioning, and past our fear of stepping outside the box of what the government sets for us, it's all pointing to the fact that this war on drugs has been absolutely insane.
Exactly. So we think about driving in the same way, in similar ways. It's potentially dangerous activity, but we enhance the safety by making sure that people have driver's ed courses. They have a number of sort of educational opportunities to learn how to enhance safety.
So, but I'd like to talk about the legalization, decriminalization thing, and also about the example we've seen in places like Portugal and the Netherlands, and whether that's instructive for what we could do here. So, what are you advocating for?
Yeah. So in High Price, I argue that the country
That's
should.
High Price.
High Price, the book. My publicist will be happy.
Available on Amazon.com.
My publicist will be happy. Thank you. One of the things that I argue for in the book is that we decriminalize all drugs, from heroin to methamphetamine to marijuana, all of them. Now, some people say, well, why not legalize? And some people don't know the distinction. Mm-hmm. So legalization would be like what we're doing with alcohol. If you're over 21, you can legally purchase and use the substance without fear of prosecution, and people can sell it legally. Decriminalization, the drugs still remain illegal. However, a criminal penalty is not associated with use. That is, you would get what's equivalent to a traffic violation. Mm-hmm. In Portugal, they've decriminalized all of these drugs, and when people get caught with possessing a certain amount, I think a 10-day supply, they may be required to meet before a board comprised of 3 professionals. Someone maybe in the legal profession, medical profession, the treatment sort of profession. They evaluate the person to see if they need treatment and so forth.
Whereas here we just throw you in jail.
Right. And notice in Portugal, law enforcement is not included in this mix because they have no skills for this particular issue. And so we certainly can look at the Portugal model. They have been decriminalized since 2001. Mm-hmm. And by all of the major indicators, drug use and those sorts of things, they are doing as well or comparable to their European counterparts. And they don't have any plans to
change what they're doing. So their model seems to be working
They
for
also
them.
don't have prisons that are full
They don't
of
have
drug
right,
users
right.
who are then can't get jobs when they come out and are introduced to more hardened criminals who are more involved in crime and so on and so forth, all the other common problems that we have here in the United States. So I would say they're doing better, but in that
That's
regard
right.
anyway.
That's right.
And why not legalize? Why decriminalization instead of legalization?
Yeah, I argue that legalization, in this country, we're so ignorant about drugs. And one of my concerns is that if we legalize drugs, they might become more readily available. Now, that may not be such a bad thing. I'm not arguing that you'll see more problems. I'm arguing that more problems will be attributed to the drugs, whether it's true or not, because we're so ignorant. So my argument is that we should have a corresponding increase in education along with this decriminalization. And so decriminalization can serve as an intermediary step. And maybe we will reevaluate and see whether we should legalize everything. I don't know, but what I do know is that we need to increase the education first along with decriminalization.
So whatever angle you want to look at it, there are people out there providing incredible perspectives, but the main thing for me is that in terms of the health of our society and the health of people who are going to want to explore their altered states of consciousness with drugs and illegal drugs, there needs to be education. And so people have begun realizing this and begun realizing that we actually need to take this into our own hands. And there's one guy who's been incredibly inspiring. He started up a channel called Psyched Substance, which I highly recommend going and checking. That's on YouTube. Now, he on there talks about all things educational around drugs. He tells you how to take MDMA in a safe way, how to test your pills, how to reduce the harm, how to not get a hangover or a come down, what sort of set and setting to use it in. He talks about all his own personal experiences. He just provides incredible education, which our government should really be doing if they actually cared about the health and well-being of human societies, which they flat out don't. And to show you how much people are craving this sort of information, he has nearly 1.4 million subscribers to his YouTube channel, and many of his videos have millions or hundreds and hundreds of thousands and over 1 million views. That just shows how much people are craving this, and I can't even begin to comprehend how many potentially lives he's saved or how much catastrophe or danger he's prevented because of the education he's provided. He's taught me a hell of a lot. And it's amazing that someone out there has just gone and done it. He's inspired many other channels, many other YouTubers, and given a lot of other people the confidence to speak up about these sort of matters and not be under so much fear of this prohibition we've been under. And so I highly recommend going and checking him out because he's got some amazing points based on all these things. So that channel is called Psyched Substance. And the other thing is also, as was mentioned in a few of those quotes, that people just think everyone will be addicted. But once again, we're not all addicted. We don't all drink coffee. We don't all smoke cigarettes. We don't all drink alcohol. We don't all get addicted to sleeping pills like I was, even though these things are all available there for everyone to use. Some people do, some people don't. Some people try illicit drugs and get addicted. Some people don't. I tried them. I didn't get addicted. I just wanted to have an experience. I got it, and I didn't have much more desire after that to do them. So why do some people get addicted and why some don't? It's not because they're legal or illegal. This black and white perspective, I know I've repeated myself a bit, but it's so ridiculous. Addiction's a complex issue. One of the world's leading addiction researchers, Dr. Gabor Mate, he talks about it's incredibly complex. It goes back to our wounding. Most people who get addictions have big gaps within their soul that they're trying to fill because they've been abused or they've been brought up in neglect or they haven't had the emotional support they need or they've got some sort of trauma that they're holding on to that they're seeking for relief from, and it's the relief that they get addicted to. Drugs are just drugs. Drugs aren't addictive in themselves. It's the relief that they create in our bodies that we get really addicted to.
What I learned could be summed up really very briefly, by saying that addiction is not a choice that anybody makes, it's not a moral failure, it's not an ethical lapse, it's not a weakness of character, it's not a failure of will, which is how our society depicts addiction, nor is it an inherited brain disease, which is how the medical tendency is to see it. What it actually is, it's a response to human suffering. And all these people that I worked with had been severely traumatized as children. All the women had been sexually abused, all the men had been traumatized, some of them sexually, physically, emotionally neglected. And not only is that my perspective, it's also what the scientific and research literature shows. So addiction then is actually, rather than being a disease as such or a human choice, it actually is, it's an attempt to escape suffering temporarily.
And so it's so crazy that we judge people for when really they need help. We judge people for going to these illegal drugs. It's just those drugs are just providing the relief that they need. They provide better relief for that person than does a legal option. Because as we know now, that all the legal drugs are just to keep us in this narrow-minded consciousness to operate the machinery and do the logical thinking that keeps this machine ticking over. That's not everyone's medicine. So yeah, as I've been saying this, it's such a complex issue that there's so many different angles, and I really hope that I've pointed you, if you haven't already thought about these things, hopefully I've pointed you in the direction of some good information and some good research so that you can start expanding your mind, because what's at risk here is our own freedom, the most precious, intimate freedom we can ever have, which is the freedom of our own consciousness. They're trying to take away your freedom over your own internal consciousness, which we just can't stand for. Anyway, thank you very much. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. And if there's any questions or other things you'd like me to talk about in future videos. And thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next video. And please don't forget to subscribe.
Not so fast there, buddy. Don't you dare think about subscribing to this channel. Anyone who subscribes to this channel is giving the green light to drugs, and there is no such thing as a safe drug. Oh yeah, that's the shit. Oh. If you subscribe to this channel, that means you are a criminal. And with my power and my authority, I will come and shut this channel down, and I will come after you because you do not have the right to have any fun or to explore your own consciousness. It just isn't acceptable.